So we want to start when we're looking at the contact of Native Americans with Europeans or this clash of civilizations. I start with Columbus and the Spanish Empire. We there it's not that Columbus is like necessarily the first person that comes to the Americas. We know that the Vikings had landed in off the coast of Canada. There's evidence that maybe the Chinese had also sailed across the Pacific. Um, Also, the Spanish weren't even the leaders in navigation at this time period. We have Muslim traders that really had excelled in the art of shipbuilding and the navigation of seas. We know that the Portuguese had started to establish training outposts and expeditions along the west coast of Africa and into India. But for this purpose, we're going to look at Columbus and the Spanish Empire. So when we're looking at Columbus and we're looking at the Spanish and Europeans as a result of Columbus's actions, it's really important to know that this is primarily an example of voluntary migration. All right, these people are moving from Europe to the Americas, right, on their own accord. And so there's really three reasons why Columbus and Spanish, conquistadors and explorers after him were traveling to North America and exploring. Gold, God, and glory, right? The search for gold and riches was one of the main reasons why Columbus's journey in 1492 happened at all. While looking for gold, as he visited, this is his first expedition in 1492, as he visited for like 96 days, he went through all these like little islands and territories in what we call the Caribbean Ocean, the Caribbean Sea, excuse me. Every time he came across a piece of land, he claimed that land and territory for Spain. So that's the glory part, not just individual glory, but glory for a nation. And then at the same time, he promised to spread the Christian and more so the Catholic faith to these new inhabitants. And so when Columbus comes back, right, from this first expedition, thrills the Spanish monarchs, King Ferdinand and Isabella. They see that the potential that Columbus has, or the potential that Columbus's expeditions have for their country, the power, the prestige, and the wealth of their country. So the next time Columbus sets out, he's not an explorer anymore, but he's an empire builder, right? And so you want to think about sorry, I'm trying to close my door. You want to think about the impact that that has, right, on shaping the lives of society or the people, right, that are impacted or come into contact with Columbus, either as part of his men, right, or as like the Native Americans who are now receiving this invasion and receiving this contact here. When you have somebody like Columbus and the Spanish that are now intent on building an empire. The impact that Columbus's expedition had on a wider group of Europeans, pretty profound as well. Other merchants, businessmen, they saw Columbus's expedition as a way and an opportunity to increase their wealth and influence. So they started to seek out ways that they could migrate and take advantage of this migration to the Americas. Other monarchs, in France and in England, they saw Columbus's voyages as a way or as an example of how they could then migrate to the Americas and increase their wealth and their influence on a greater stage. Ordinary people saw a chance to migrate to the Americas as a way to, start fresh, right? And live in a world relatively free from any sort of social economic constraints or restrictions that they had back then. So when we see people start to, come to like Jamestown for economic reasons or Plymouth for religious reasons, they're leaving the old system behind and they're moving voluntarily. They're moving, to the Americas for a new and relatively like free, right, way of living life as they choose, right? And I say relatively free. The result of this voluntary migration from the Americas to Europe um, became known as the Columbian Exchange. So one of the impacts that we see here of this voluntary migration of the Europeans to the Americas is this Columbian Exchange. And the Columbian Exchange is just an exchange of goods, right, resources, and products from Europe to the Americas. And you see some examples here. Some of some of these animals and plants that we are accustomed to today, all right, did not originate, or they're not indigenous to the Americas. They were brought over as a result of European migration. And then vice versa, right? We see the introduction of certain foods and products and stuff from the Americas to Europe. And this is known as the Columbian Exchange, the exchange of food and products and animals and diseases, right? From what we call the old world to the new world, and from the new world to the old world. One of the big things here is that one of the biggest impacts of the Columbian Exchange was that introduction of disease to Native American societies. That's going to be the number one killer of Native Americans after European contact or after the European invasion. All right, so looking at British North America primarily based along the Atlantic seaboard. So we're looking at the British North American colonies right here, all right, along the seaboard here. Remember, we got the Powhatan, and you have the Iroquois over here, and so there we have to remember that there is that Native American presence here that has already been established and had been established for quite some time. The two earliest settlements here, that once again, primarily voluntary migration, Jamestown, Virginia, which would be down here, all right, in 1607, the earliest settlement or permanent settlement for the British in North America, and then Plymouth, Massachusetts, which is right up here. All right, Jamestown, people are going to Jamestown or migrating to Jamestown voluntarily, primarily because of economic reasons, right? And so you see a lot of young males, single, right? And they are there to get rich. In Plymouth, more religious, right? Going, coming to North America, really to be able to exercise a certain sense of religious freedom. So more family oriented, and so you see men, women, and children coming and establishing themselves here in Plymouth. The relationship with Native Americans here, and this is something that we're going to look at as a reason for involuntary migration of Native Americans. It's different from the Spanish and the French. The British believe, they believe that there needs to be two separate spheres between the Europeans and the Native Americans, and they shouldn't live amongst each other. The Spanish lived amongst the Native Americans. The French lived among the Native Americans. The British saying, here's our sphere, right? And you don't live in it. You live outside the sphere, all right? And so you can see with this mentality, that's going to cause a lot of violence and conflict as the British start to establish settlements here. They're going to kick the Native Americans out of that land. So that's the start of that involuntary migration of Native Americans. And we see two cases of how that violence and conflict resulted in the forced migration of Native Americans during British North America. The Anglo-Powhatan War took place in Virginia, and as a result, the Powhatan Native Americans were forced to move west, and King Philip's War took place in New England, in the Massachusetts area. And once again, it resulted in the Native Americans being forced to move west. The other thing that we want to look at here when we look at the setup of British North America is the regional differences, largely based on geography. So you're starting to see the southern, like Jamestown, because of the fertile land, because of the climate, largely farming based. Right. And so we'll see cash crops like tobacco being the basis of that economy. And when you're farming, you need a labor source. So at first, that labor source were indentured servants. Once again, that's a form of relatively voluntary migration. People that are coming to the Americas in search for a better life. But they're getting somebody to pay for their travels, right? And in exchange for somebody to pay for their travel to the Americas, the indentured servant now has to work for them for about 5 or 7 years, and then they get their freedom. So, in a sense, voluntary migration. We know as a result of Bacon's Rebellion, we start to see that shift away from indentured servants to enslaved Africans. And when we look at enslaved Africans, we know that we want to realize that is a case of involuntary migration and settlement there in the case of the African people and the Americas. In the middle colonies, we're looking at like right here in the middle colonies, we're thinking about New York, right? Pennsylvania. It's a mix. It's more, it has some farming, but it also is primarily based on business, right? So New York City, think about like nowadays that the Empire State, a lot of commerce and business comes through New York City. Same thing back then. A lot of trade was happening. A lot of merchants were stationed in like places like um, um, New York City and uh, not Pittsburgh, um, Philadelphia, excuse me. And then up in the north, more smaller towns, some businesses, but mostly their economies are based on fishing, shipbuilding, lumber, just because of the soil and the climate was not suitable for farming. So we see as the farther north you get, the less of an emphasis on that forced labor source. So we'll start to see because of migration and settlement and the way that the economy is being shaped up, slavery and indentured servitude much more prevalent in the southern colonies and even in the middle colonies, but less of a presence here in the north. A major turning point in migration and settlement of British North America happened with the French and Indian War. And so what we start to see here is as the British are starting to migrate out west, all right, and I'm looking at this left-hand picture, they started to come into contact with the French, who are also migrating and settling in North America. And just like with the Native Americans, this becomes a source of conflict. And this French and Indian War is really based on or caused by competition, right? To the land here in the middle, what's called the Ohio River Valley, right? And so the cause of this is just land, right, and territory, and the ability to migrate and settle in this disputed area. The sides, you have the French and Indian on one side, and you have the British and their colonists on the other. The result, as you can see in this map, the British won the war, and as a result of that, you see, right, now that allows for more, the potentially more, migration west and settlement west of the British and their colonists. The potential is there, right? Because they have access to that territory. You will also see then that diminishes the ability of the French now, right, to migrate and settle and establish a presence there in North America. So that French and Indian War is really key there because it increases the opportunity and the potential for the British to migrate and settle in North America, and it decreases the opportunity for the French, right, to settle in North America. And you think about it, the Native Americans are on the losing side of this war, right? We can expect that the British are going to continue their policies of, forced migration of the Native Americans.